Welcome to Dusky Lore. Close your eyes, dim the lights, and listen closely as the shadows begin to speak. Story 1. Charlotte was supposed to be a quick job. One of those where you get in, do what you came to do, and get out. 3 days of meetings with a client in the manufacturing sector and then back home to Philadelphia. April 2023 had been brutal on my schedule. The company kept sending me to a different city almost every week for those consulting jobs. Most of the guys who graduated with me in 2012 were already deep into family life, coaching children's baseball teams and complaining about lawn care, while I was still memorizing hotel checkout times and surviving on expense reports. The Airbnb I found was suspiciously cheap for being downtown, $62 a night when almost everything else was around $200. But my company had a reimbursement limit, and I had become an expert at finding deals that let me keep the difference. The listing photo showed a modest 3-story building, nothing special, but functional. I arrived around 9 o'clock that Wednesday night, after fighting traffic from the airport. The street was strangely quiet. There were only a few parked cars and the dim glow of some shops that were closing. I took my suitcase out of the trunk, entered the code on the lockbox, and climbed the narrow staircase to Unit 3B without crossing paths with a single person. The apartment smelled faintly of lemon-scented cleaner, that artificial freshness hosts use to disguise the reality that strangers come and go every few days. Everything looked close enough to the photos, although it was clearly more worn. The wooden floors had deep scratches near the doors. The sofa cushions held permanent depressions from countless bodies, and the kitchen appliances had that yellowed plastic look of things too old to seem modern, but too functional to replace. Still, the bed was made with clean white sheets. The bathroom had fresh towels, and the Wi-Fi connected on the first try. For what I needed, it was enough. What caught my attention was the small balcony beside the living room. It barely had space for 2 cheap plastic chairs and a neglected plant that had been dead for months. After unpacking, I stepped outside for a moment to get some air, and that was when I noticed the view. Right across the street, maybe about 40 feet away, there was an elegant jewelry store with tasteful display windows and security lights bathing the counters full of watches and diamonds in a warm glow. I thought it would have been a good place to smoke if I still smoked. I stood there for a few minutes checking work emails, watching the jewelry catch the light, then went inside and fell asleep from sheer exhaustion without thinking much more about it. Thursday passed in a blurred mix of conference rooms and handshakes. The client was demanding but reasonable, and by 6 in the evening I had already wrapped up most of the important conversations. I stopped at a Thai restaurant a few blocks from the apartment, ate dinner alone at the bar while watching a basketball game I did not care about, and returned to the Airbnb around 8:30. The building was quiet again. On the 2nd floor landing, I crossed paths with an older woman who nodded politely but did not say anything. Once inside, I took off my shoes, loosened my tie, and decided to step out onto the balcony for a while before diving into the report I had to finish. The night air was cool and pleasant, that perfect spring temperature where you do not need a jacket, but you are glad to be wearing long sleeves. I leaned against the railing looking toward the street, watching a couple walking hand in hand, when something caught my eye. It was a small black shape hidden underneath the metal handrail, almost invisible unless you were standing at that exact angle. At first I thought it was a piece of electrical tape or some kind of waterproofing material, but when I crouched down to look at it more closely, I felt my throat tighten. It was a camera, compact and deliberately hidden. Its tiny lens was pointed directly at the jewelry store across the street. I stayed crouched there for what felt like a full minute, staring at that thing that should not have been there. The camera looked professional, a matte black casing with no visible markings, fixed in place with industrial adhesive and positioned with precision. It was not some random security measure a paranoid landlord might have installed. It was pointing outward, not toward the apartment entrance or the balcony. Someone had put it there specifically to watch the jewelry store, and they had done it carefully enough that an ordinary guest would never notice it. I stood up slowly, my mind racing through possibilities. Maybe the Airbnb host was some kind of private investigator. Maybe the police had set up surveillance and forgotten to remove the equipment. None of the explanations made sense, but I desperately needed one of them to be true. I took out my phone and took several photos of the camera from different angles. Something instinctive told me I might need proof later. Then I went back inside the apartment and locked the balcony door, suddenly very aware of how exposed those large windows made me feel. The jewelry store glowed across the street, beautiful and unaware of everything, and I wondered what the hell I had gotten myself into. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe the previous tenant was a photography hobbyist who enjoyed capturing urban scenes. Maybe it was an old security setup the host had forgotten to mention. I paced around the living room for a few minutes until I decided I needed a glass of water to calm my nerves. The kitchen was small and narrow, barely a galley with just enough counter space to make a sandwich. I opened the cabinet above the sink looking for a clean glass. I found one. I filled it with tap water. My hands were unsteady. When I turned to set the glass on the counter, I noticed that one of the drawers underneath it was slightly open, maybe about an inch. Normally I would have ignored it, but something about that night had me on alert. It made me hyper-aware of every detail. I opened the drawer expecting to find the usual junk. Takeout menus, a can opener, maybe some dead batteries. Instead, I found a folded city map, the kind you can get for free at gas stations, worn along the creases as if it had been opened and closed dozens of times. Underneath it was a small black spiral notebook, the kind students use for taking notes. I should have closed that drawer and walked away. I should have minded my own business and gone to sleep. But my fingers were already reaching for the map before my brain could stop them. When I unfolded it, downtown Charlotte appeared, and I felt my stomach turn to ice when I saw what someone had done to it. The jewelry store across the street was circled in red ink, not once, but at least 7 or 8 times. The circles overlapped one another with obsessive intensity. Small X's marked nearby blocks, each labeled with cryptic abbreviations I could not decipher. An arrow pointed to an alley behind the store with the words "Service Entrance" written in neat, careful handwriting. I set the map aside and opened the notebook with numb fingers. The first pages seemed to contain a schedule, names I did not recognize next to times and days of the week. Carla opens Monday and Friday, arrives 8:45, disarms 8:52. Another note said, "Night security passes at 11:13, like clockwork. Never varies." Page after page contained detailed observations about how the jewelry store operated, the employees' habits, delivery schedules, and the alarm company's response times. This was not a curious neighbor taking casual notes. It was reconnaissance, methodical and meticulous, the kind of preparation that comes before something very bad. I closed the notebook and stood motionless in that tiny kitchen, beneath the hum of the fluorescent light, trying to process the fact that I was standing in what appeared to be a staging base for a robbery. My first impulse was to call the police, but something stopped me. What was I going to say? I found a camera and some notes in an Airbnb, and I think someone might be planning a crime. They would ask me questions I could not answer. Maybe they would even suspect that I was involved. I was a stranger in that city, staying in a cheap rental across from a jewelry store, and I had just admitted that I had been snooping through drawers. The situation looked terrible from every angle. I decided to pack my things quietly, leave the apartment, find a hotel for the night, and decide what to do in the morning with a clearer head. I was halfway to the bedroom to get my suitcase when I heard it. Footsteps on the stairs, slow and deliberate, the heavy weight of boots on old wooden steps. The building had been quiet all night, and those footsteps did not have the casual rhythm of someone coming home after a long day. They were measured, intentional, and they stopped on the 3rd-floor landing. I stood completely still in the middle of the living room, holding my breath, listening. Then voices, low and muffled. At least 2 people speaking in whispers just on the other side of my door. I could not make out the words, but the rhythm was unmistakable. It was a conversation, not a greeting between neighbors passing each other in the hallway. I moved toward the door as silently as possible, stepping on the edges of the floorboards where they were less likely to creak. The apartment had one of those old doors with a brass peephole, cloudy with age, but still usable. I pressed my eye to it and felt my entire body go rigid. 3 men were in the narrow hallway, clustered close together as if trying not to be heard. The one closest to my door was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket and watching the stairs as if he expected someone else to appear. The second was shorter, wiry, with a shaved head shining under the dim hallway light. The third stood a little apart from the others, at least 10 years older, with gray at his temples and the calm, patient expression of someone who had done things like this before. The tall one leaned toward the older man and said something I could not hear. The older man slowly shook his head and then answered in a voice just loud enough to reach me through the thin door. "Check if the tenant saw the installation. If he touched the materials, we handle it tonight." The shaved-headed man reached for my doorknob, and I watched in horror as he began to turn it. The deadbolt held. I had locked it out of habit when I came in, the way you do in unfamiliar places without even thinking. The knob turned left, then right, and stopped. There was a pause. Someone muttered something about keys, and I heard the older man say, "Bobby has the spare. He's coming up now." I had seconds, maybe a minute at most. My mind went blank with panic and then shifted into survival mode with a clarity I did not know I possessed. The fire escape. It was my only way out. I moved fast but tried not to make noise. I grabbed my phone and wallet from the kitchen counter and left everything else. The bedroom had a window facing the same direction as the balcony, and I remembered seeing a fire escape during my brief inspection of the apartment. I went into the bedroom and opened the window carefully, wincing when I heard the soft scrape of wood against wood. The fire escape was there, old and rusty, but solid enough, descending into a narrow alley between buildings. Behind me, I heard new footsteps on the landing. Bobby with the spare key, I assumed. Then the sound of metal entering a lock. I stepped out onto the fire escape and left the window almost closed behind me, barely open so it would not jam and trap me outside if I needed to come back in. Not that I had any intention of ever setting foot in that apartment again. The fire escape shook under my weight as I climbed down. Every step released a metallic groan that sounded deafening to me in the silent night. I forced myself to move slowly, gripping the handrail with white knuckles, terrified that the noise would alert the men who were already entering the apartment to my presence. Second floor, first floor, then a vertical ladder descending the last 10 feet to the alley. I hung from the final rung and dropped, landing hard on the concrete and feeling the impact shoot up through my ankles. The alley was dark and narrow, lined with dumpsters and back entrances to businesses that had closed hours earlier. From above came muffled sounds, footsteps moving through the apartment, a door slamming, someone shouting something I could not understand. They had discovered I was gone. I ran. I did not jog. I did not walk fast. I ran with everything I had toward the strip of light at the end of the alley, where it opened onto a main street. My dress shoes struck the damp pavement. My lungs burned, and I did not look back once. I burst onto the sidewalk and almost collided with a woman walking her dog. She gave me a startled look while I muttered an apology and kept moving. 2 blocks later, I found a sports bar full of people visible through the windows, and I entered like a drowning man reaching a raft. I found a table in the back corner, sat with my back against the wall, and tried to steady my breathing while a waitress asked if I wanted anything. I ordered a beer. I had no intention of drinking it. I just needed a reason to stay. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock my phone, but I managed to open the photos I had taken of the balcony camera. Proof. I had proof. I called 911 and told the operator everything. The hidden camera, the map with the jewelry store circled, the notebook full of schedules, the 3 men who had arrived at the apartment, and what I had heard them say through the door. The operator kept me on the line while she sent units to the building, asking me to describe everything again, this time more slowly. 20 minutes later, 2 officers found me in the bar and escorted me to their patrol car. They drove me back to the block where the Airbnb was, but we did not go inside. Instead, we parked across the street, and I watched from the back seat as more police arrived. then detectives in unmarked cars, then a van that I later learned belonged to a task force that had been investigating a string of high-end jewelry store robberies across 3 states. The officers questioned me for more than an hour. They took notes, recorded my statement, and reviewed the photos on my phone. One of them told me I had been lucky, that those guys were professionals, that people who stumble onto operations like that usually do not get the chance to run. The investigation took months to unfold, but I only learned the details much later, through news reports and one follow-up call from a detective named Reyes. The apartment had been rented under a false identity and paid for with prepaid cards that were nearly impossible to trace. The 3 men I saw were part of a crew responsible for at least 4 other robberies, all targeting high-end jewelry stores in mid-sized cities across the Southeast. They rented apartments with a good line of sight, spent weeks documenting patterns and security protocols, and then carried out quick, precise robberies that lasted under 3 minutes. The night I escaped, apparently, they had gone there to recover their surveillance equipment and finalize the last details of the plan. The robbery was scheduled for that weekend. My accidental discovery forced them to abandon the job and scatter. 2 of them were arrested 6 weeks later during a traffic stop in Tennessee. The 3rd disappeared, and as far as I know, is still at large. I never went back for my suitcase or the clothes I left behind. The Airbnb listing disappeared from the platform within days, and I never received a response from the host when I tried to contact him. Sometimes I think about how close I came to something irreversible, about how the simple habit of locking the deadbolt bought me the 60 seconds I needed to survive. I still travel for work. I still book cheap rentals in cities I do not know. But now I check every drawer, every corner, and every angle of every room before I unpack. And I always sleep with a chair wedged under the doorknob. Story 2. October 2022 was hard for me in a way I still struggle to explain. First came the layoff from the marketing agency where I had worked since graduating college in 2017. Then came the kind of breakup that leaves you staring at the ceiling at 3 in the morning, wondering at exactly what point everything went wrong. At 26, I found myself with severance pay, an empty apartment that still smelled like my ex-boyfriend's cologne, and an overwhelming need to be anywhere else. My friend Kelsey had been living in Portland for about 2 years and kept texting me to say I should come visit her, that a change of scenery would do me good. So I booked an Airbnb, an upstairs unit in a duplex on Burwood Road, and decided to drive from Seattle for a long weekend. The listing looked perfect in that carefully staged way online rentals usually do. Exposed brick, a clawfoot tub, morning light coming through tall windows. The reviews were mostly positive. Guests praised the quiet neighborhood and the host, a man named Garrett, for responding quickly. I packed an overnight bag and left on a Friday afternoon, hoping a few days away would help me figure out what came next. I arrived at the duplex around 4 in the afternoon, and the place looked even better than it had in the photos. It was an old Victorian house painted sage green with white trim, located on a tree-lined street where the oaks were just starting to show their autumn colors. The neighborhood had that settled calm of old places, people walking dogs, children riding bikes in driveways. A scene that makes you feel safe without having to think about it. I took my bag out of the trunk of my Subaru and walked toward the side entrance that led to my unit, following the check-in instructions Garrett had sent me. That was when the front door of the downstairs unit flew open so hard it shook the frame. A man stepped out onto the porch. He was probably in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, with thinning gray hair and hollow cheeks that made his eyes look too large for his face. He was wearing a flannel shirt buttoned incorrectly, one side hanging lower than the other. His gaze locked onto me with an intensity that stopped me dead in the middle of the path. Before I could say hello or anything at all, he pointed a trembling finger at my face and spoke in a voice loaded with accusation. "You came back to finish what you started, didn't you?" I stood there for a moment, completely thrown off, my bag hanging awkwardly from my shoulder. My first instinct was to laugh because it had to be some kind of confusion or maybe a strange joke. "I'm sorry," I managed to say. keeping my voice light and friendly. "I think you have me confused with someone else. I just arrived. I'm renting the upstairs unit for the weekend." The man's expression did not soften. If anything, his eyes narrowed more, scanning my face as if searching for something hidden beneath the surface. He took a step toward the edge of the porch, close enough for me to see the patchy beard along his jaw and the deeply marked dark circles under his eyes. "That's exactly what you would say," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "That's exactly what they told you to say." I felt my smile fall apart, not knowing how to respond. After an awkward silence that stretched as if it lasted a full minute, he finally turned around and retreated inside, slamming the door so hard the porch railing vibrated. I stayed frozen on the path for a few more seconds, trying to process what had just happened. Then I pushed it out of my mind and went up the exterior stairs to my unit, telling myself that every neighborhood has eccentric characters. Maybe he had dementia. Maybe he was just having a bad day. People say strange things sometimes. That does not always mean something sinister. The upstairs apartment was exactly as advertised, clean, bright, with that exposed brick wall and the beautiful clawfoot tub I had seen in the photos. I set my bag on the bed and texted Kelsey to tell her I had arrived safely. Then I spent the next hour unpacking and settling in. We made plans to have dinner together the next night, and I poured myself a glass of the wine I had brought, sat by the window, and watched the street darken as the sun went down. By 9, I had almost convinced myself that the encounter with the downstairs neighbor had been nothing more than an uncomfortable misunderstanding, something I would laugh about later. I put on my pajamas, got into bed, which turned out to be surprisingly comfortable, and closed my eyes. That was when he started pacing. At first, I thought it was just the normal noises of an old house settling, or maybe the neighbor moving around before bed. But as I lay there in the dark, I realized the footsteps were deliberate, back and forth, directly beneath my bedroom. The floors in those old Victorian houses are thin, and I could follow his movements with unsettling precision. He walked from one end of what I assumed was his living room to the other, stopped for a few seconds, turned and walked back, over and over like a caged animal. I looked at my phone. It was almost 11. I told myself he was probably an insomniac, maybe anxious about something, and that he would eventually calm down. But then I started hearing his voice. It came muffled through the floor, impossible to understand in full sentences, but the rhythm was clear. He was talking to himself, or maybe talking to someone who was not there. I pressed my ear against the mattress, straining to listen, and caught fragments that tightened my chest. They sent them again. "She thinks I don't know," and something that sounded terribly like, "This time I'll be ready." I slept very little that night. Every time I started to drift off, the footsteps returned, or I heard that low murmuring voice rising through the floorboards like smoke. When pale morning light began filtering through the curtains, I had maybe slept 2 hours, and only in broken stretches. I lay there debating what to do. Should I message Garrett, the host? Should I just leave and find a hotel? Part of me felt ridiculous for being so shaken by what was probably nothing more than a lonely man with mental health problems who did not pose any real threat. I decided to give it another chance and see how everything looked in daylight. I showered, got dressed, and made myself a cup of coffee with the little Keurig on the kitchen counter. Around 8 in the morning, I gathered the small bag of trash I had accumulated, the wine bottle, some snack wrappers, and went downstairs to find the bins Garrett had mentioned, located on the side of the house. The morning air was crisp and clean. For a moment, everything felt normal again. Birds were singing. A jogger passed on the sidewalk, and somewhere nearby you could smell bacon cooking. I was turning the corner toward the trash bins, and the downstairs door flew open and he rushed out. He had a kitchen knife in his right hand. I dropped the trash bag and stumbled backward, almost tripping over my own feet. He stopped about 6 feet from me, close enough for me to see the blade reflecting the morning light, close enough to notice how badly his hand was shaking. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, rimmed with red as if he had not slept in days. There was a layer of sweat on his forehead despite the cold air. Admit it, he said, his voice breaking over the words. Say who hired you. I know you're one of them. I know they sent you to watch me and report back. Who was it? The government? My ex-wife? Just tell me the truth and maybe we can fix this. I slowly raised my hands, palms facing him, trying to keep my breathing steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought I might faint. I don't know what you're talking about, I said, forcing myself to keep my voice calm. My name is Whitney. I'm only here for the weekend. I've never seen you before in my life. I swear to God. He stared at me for a long moment, the knife trembling in his hand, and I truly did not know if he was about to lunge at me or collapse crying. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, something in his expression shifted. His shoulders sank and he lowered the knife to his side, although he did not let go of it. That's what the last one said too, he muttered, now in a hollow voice, drained of the intensity from before. They always say that. They always have a story. He turned around and shuffled back inside without another word. He closed the door behind him with a soft click that somehow was more disturbing than a slam. I stood at the side of the house, shaking, my legs feeling like they might give out at any moment. As soon as I could move, I ran back up to my unit, locked the door, and put a chair against it just in case. I picked up my phone and immediately called Garrett, the host. The words came out of me in a panicked rush as I described what had just happened. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Garrett sighed, not with concern, but with something that sounded almost like mild annoyance. "Oh, that's Howard," he said, as if he were excusing a barking dog. "He's been going through a rough patch lately. Divorce, lost his job. You know how it is. He's really harmless. Just try to avoid him and you'll be fine." I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to ask how a man who points a knife at a guest could be considered harmless. But Garrett kept talking, assuring me that Howard had been living in the downstairs unit for more than 3 years and had never actually hurt anyone. He said he just had episodes once in a while, and that they usually passed in a day or two. He offered me a partial refund if I wanted to leave early, but he said it in a tone that made it clear he thought I was overreacting. I hung up feeling more alone than I had felt in months. Kelsey was working and could not come get me until evening. The idea of walking to my car, which was parked on the street directly within Howard's line of sight, filled me with terror. So I stayed inside. I double-checked that all the windows were locked and kept the chair wedged against the door. I tried to distract myself with my phone, scrolling through social media, but I kept looking toward the floor every time I heard a creak from below. Around noon, the footsteps started again, back and forth, back and forth, that insistent rhythm that seemed to vibrate in my teeth. Then at some point in the afternoon, the footsteps stopped, and I heard someone coming up the exterior stairs toward my door. I held my breath, standing in the middle of the living room, staring at the door as if it could explode inward at any second. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs. There was a long pause, 10 seconds, maybe 15, and then a soft scraping sound, like paper sliding over wood. I watched as a folded sheet of notebook paper slipped through the gap under the door and came to rest on the wooden floor, about 2 feet in front of me. The footsteps went back down the stairs, slow and deliberate. Then I heard Howard's door open and close. I did not move for at least a full minute. When I finally gathered the courage to pick up the note, my fingers felt numb and clumsy, as if they belonged to someone else. The handwriting was uneven and jagged, pressed so hard into the paper that it had torn in places. It said, "I know you're here to take me. I won't go quietly. I have prepared. Tell whoever sent you that I'm ready this time. I won't let it happen again." I read it 3 times, trying to make sense of it, trying to convince myself they were only the delusions of a sick man and not a real threat. But the words "I have prepared" kept repeating in my head, and I thought about the knife he had been holding. Then I knew I had to get out of there. I started shoving clothes into my travel bag, not bothering to fold anything, just pushing everything in as fast as possible. The car keys were on the kitchen counter. I grabbed them and squeezed them so hard the metal teeth dug into my palm. I called Kelsey while I packed. She answered on the second ring, "I need you to stay on the phone with me," I said, my voice shakier than I wanted it to be. "I'm leaving right now, and I need someone to know what's happening in case something goes wrong." She asked what was going on, and I gave her the short version. Crazy neighbor, knife-threatening note. She told me to call the police. I told her I wanted to get out of there first, that I could call them from the road, that I did not want to sit there waiting for them to arrive while Howard was downstairs doing who knew what. I zipped the bag shut, slung it over my shoulder, and moved the chair away from the door. My plan was simple: go down the stairs as fast as possible, run to the car, and drive away without looking back. I took a deep breath, unlocked the deadbolt, and pulled the door open. That was when I heard the downstairs door fly open with a crash that echoed through the whole house. Heavy footsteps came up the wooden stairs fast and furious, shaking the entire structure with every step. I did not think. I just reacted. I slammed my door shut, locked the deadbolt, and shoved the chair back against it with all my strength. Kelsey was shouting my name through the phone, asking what was happening, and I could not even answer because the footsteps had already reached the top step. Then someone started pounding on my door so hard the hinges rattled. "I know what you're doing." Howard's voice cut through the wood, raw, broken, and completely unhinged. "You're not taking me. Do you hear me? I won't let you take me like you took the others." I backed away until I hit the far wall. I had the phone pressed to my ear and finally managed to choke out the words. "Call 911, Kelsey. Call them right now." The pounding continued, rhythmic and relentless, and I could see the door frame beginning to splinter where the deadbolt met the wood. I looked around desperately for another way out, and then I remembered the window, the one that opened onto a small section of roof over the back porch. I ran to it, pushed it open, and climbed out onto the sloped roof just as I heard the door finally give way behind me. The roof was steeper than it looked, and the shingles were slippery from accumulated moisture. I half crawled, half slid toward the edge, my travel bag still hanging from my shoulder, and the phone clutched in my other hand. Behind me, I could hear Howard tearing through the apartment, knocking things over, shouting about conspiracies, surveillance, and people coming to take him away. I reached the edge of the roof and looked down. Maybe it was 10 feet to the grass, maybe less. I did not let myself think about it. I threw the bag down first, then lowered myself over the edge, hung from my fingertips for 1 second and let go. I landed hard. Pain shot up through my ankles, but I was already on my feet and running before I fully registered it. I ran around the house toward my car, fumbling for the keys, not daring to look back. I could hear Howard somewhere behind me. His voice stretched through the morning air, still ranting about them, the network, and how they would not take him alive. I reached my Subaru, yanked the door open, threw myself inside, and locked it. My hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. When the engine finally roared, I pulled away from the curb without even checking traffic. I did not stop driving until I was about 3 miles away, parked in the lot of a grocery store, crying so hard I could barely breathe. The police found Howard inside the upstairs unit, sitting on the living room floor with the knife still in his hand. He did not resist when they arrested him. Kelsey had called 911 as soon as she heard the door break, and the officers arrived in 8 minutes. An eternity when you are running for your life, but fast enough that he did not have time to escape. I gave my statement from the grocery store parking lot, still shaking, still crying. Later that same night, a detective called me to complete the details. Apparently, Howard had been in and out of psychiatric facilities for years. He suffered from severe paranoid schizophrenia and had stopped taking his medication about 2 months before I arrived. Garrett, the host, knew about his condition, but thought he could manage the situation because Howard had been stable for a while. The detective told me I was lucky. Howard had made similar accusations against a previous guest 6 months earlier, a woman who cut her stay short after he followed her to her car. No charges were filed that time because she just wanted to forget what had happened. I still think about that sometimes, about how close I came to becoming another story swept under the rug. I left a detailed review on the Airbnb listing to warn other travelers and reported Garrett to the platform. The listing was removed a few weeks later. I never went back to Portland. And even now, 2 years later, I check the locks twice before going to sleep. I still startle when I hear footsteps on the stairs. Some fears, once they find you, never fully let go. Story 3. Now, booking apps make me nauseous. I do not mean that as an exaggeration. I mean physically nauseous. My friends invite me to travel with them, and I make excuses because I cannot explain what happened in April 2018 without sounding paranoid or crazy. I was 26 and had just come out of a disastrous breakup that left me empty inside. I decided that traveling alone would fix me. A coworker had done that whole backpacking through Eastern Europe experience and would not stop sending photos of cheap hostels and empty beaches. I had savings from my consulting jobs, the flexibility to work remotely for a few weeks, and nothing holding me at home anymore. So I chose a small coastal country I had only seen mentioned in budget travel blogs, off the tourist routes with beautiful old towns and prices that seemed almost too good to be true. I told myself it would be an adventure, a reset. I found an apartment on one of those rental platforms. Nothing luxurious, but cheap. About 40 euros a night for a one-bedroom in a town whose name I still cannot pronounce properly. The reviews were decent, maybe 15 total, all short and generic but positive enough. The host called himself Bogdan. He replied quickly and seemed helpful in the app messages. He sent me the address and the lockbox code where the key would be. My flight had 2 connections, and by the time I landed, it was already night. A bus took me from the airport to the town center. Then I walked maybe 20 minutes dragging my suitcase over uneven cobblestones and using my phone's GPS to orient myself. The building was old, 5 or 6 stories, with a heavy wooden door that groaned when I pushed it open. The interior staircase smelled like cigarette smoke mixed with something damp, and the lights worked on a timer that shut off every 30 seconds, leaving me in darkness between floors while I fumbled for the next switch. The apartment was on the 4th floor. I took the key from the box, went inside, and immediately felt relieved. It looked exactly like the photos, maybe even a little better. Clean, with a small kitchen and a bed that looked comfortable enough. I set down my bags and went to close the curtains. Then I noticed that the window faced the interior courtyard and another building across from it. Some windows there had lights on with people moving around inside their homes. Normal things. I showered, ate some crackers I had brought with me, and decided to go out to find a real meal, since I had seen some restaurants still open near the bus stop. It was around 10 at night. It was cold but not freezing, and the streets were almost empty. I found a place that had the menu in English, ordered some kind of meat dish using gestures and my translation app, and ate quickly. The waiter was kind, although he did not speak much English. I paid in cash, left a tip, and started walking back. That was when I saw them for the first time. 2 men were standing near the entrance to my building, right beside the heavy wooden door. They were not doing anything in particular. They were just standing there smoking and speaking quietly to each other. One was tall and thin, maybe in his 40s, wearing a dark jacket. The other was shorter, heavier, with a shaved head and a tracksuit. I would not have thought twice about them if not for the way they both stopped talking and turned to look at me when I approached. It was not a casual glance. It was a direct fixed stare that followed me as I entered the building code and pushed the door open. I felt their eyes on my back as I stepped inside. The door closed behind me, and I stood in the dark staircase, my heart beating faster than it should have been. I told myself I was being paranoid, jet lag, an unfamiliar place, my mind playing tricks on me. But something about the way they looked at me, as if they had been waiting for me, stayed with me as I climbed the 4 floors in that darkness interrupted by clicks. I slept badly that night. I woke up again and again because of noises I could not identify. Pipes creaking, doors closing somewhere in the building, muffled voices that could have been coming from neighboring apartments or from the stairwell. I could not tell. Around 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps outside my door, slow, deliberate footsteps that stopped right in front of my apartment. I stayed completely still in bed, barely breathing, staring at the thin strip of light under the door. A shadow passed over it. Someone was standing there. I waited for a knock, some kind of sign, but after maybe a minute, the footsteps continued down the hallway and faded away. I did not sleep again. I lay there watching the ceiling turn gray as the sun came up, convincing myself it was probably just a neighbor coming home late. Nothing more. In the morning around 8, I finally got up and checked my phone. There was a message from Bogdan on the rental app, sent at 6 in the morning. It said in broken English, "You came home very late. Who brought you?" I read it 3 times trying to understand what he meant. How did he know what time I had come back? There were no visible cameras in the apartment. I had checked when I arrived. And what did he mean by who brought me? I had come back alone. I replied asking what he meant. I tried to sound casual, saying I had only gone out to dinner and came back around 10:30. He read the message immediately but did not answer. I sat on the edge of the bed with the phone in my hand, and the uncomfortable feeling from the night before came rushing back. Someone was watching me. Bogdan himself or someone reporting to him. Maybe the 2 men outside. Maybe both. I walked to the window and looked down into the courtyard, half expecting to see them staring up, but it was empty. I decided to go out to clear my head, maybe find a cafe with Wi-Fi and research the area a little. But when I went to open the front door, I noticed something that left me frozen. The lock. It was an old brass latch lock, and around the keyhole were scratches that I was sure had not been there before. Recent scratches with bright metal showing through beneath the darker patina. And the door frame near the strike plate had a small dent, as if someone had tried to force it with a flathead screwdriver or something similar. I crouched down to look more closely. The wood was slightly splintered. There were small fragments on the floor that I must have stepped on when I came in the night before without noticing. Someone had tried to force their way into the apartment while I was inside, while I was sleeping. My mind started racing through possibilities. Maybe it had happened before I arrived, but the scratches looked fresh. Maybe I was wrong to think they had not been there. But I had examined the lock when I took out the key, checking that it worked properly. Those marks were new. I took my passport, wallet, and phone, put them in my jacket, and left the apartment. I needed to report it to someone, anyone with authority. I used the translation app to figure out where the nearest police station was. It was about a 15-minute walk toward the town center. The morning was bright, and there were already more people in the streets, locals going about their business, and I started to calm down a little. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe Bogdan had sent someone to check the apartment, and they had trouble with the lock. There had to be an explanation. The police station was a small building with a faded sign I could not read. Inside, there was a counter where a uniformed woman looked up at me with no expression. I tried to explain in English what had happened, showing her the photos I had taken of the lock and the door frame. She called a male officer who spoke a little English, and I had to tell the whole thing again. The scratches, the host's message, the men who had watched me. He listened, nodded, and then exchanged a glance with the woman that I did not like at all. The officer told me I had probably misunderstood the situation, that old buildings have old locks and scratches are normal, that the host was probably just being kind, checking on his guest. He suggested that maybe I was tired from traveling and seeing things that were not there. His tone was not exactly rude, but it was dismissive in a way that felt deliberate, as if he were reading from a script. I asked if they could at least send someone to check the door and document the damage. He said they were very busy, that it was not a priority matter, and that I should speak with my host so he could fix the lock. The woman behind the counter had gone back to her paperwork and was no longer even looking at me. I stood there for a moment, not knowing what else to say. I thanked them, which felt absurd, and left. The sun was still bright, but the streets no longer felt safe. I had a growing certainty that I was completely alone in whatever was happening, that no one was going to help me, and that going back to that apartment was a terrible idea. But my things were there, my laptop, my clothes, my charger. I could not just leave everything. I stopped at a small grocery store and bought water and some food, enough for one day. I thought maybe I could stay inside and book a bus or train to leave town the next morning. I would lose the money for the remaining nights. I no longer cared. When I returned to the building, I carefully checked the entrance before going in. No one was there. I climbed the stairs quickly, went into the apartment and locked the door. Deadbolt, chain, everything. I also pushed a chair against the door, which felt paranoid but also necessary. Then I sat on the bed and started searching for transportation out of town. The Wi-Fi was slow and kept cutting out. Booking pages were confusing, half in the local language, even after changing the settings to English. Finally, I found a bus leaving at 7 the next morning, about 10 hours later, and bought a ticket. I only had to get through one more night. That was all. One more night and I would be gone. I wrote to Bogdan saying I had a family emergency and needed to leave early, hoping that would explain my sudden departure without raising suspicion. He read the message, but again did not respond. Around 4 in the afternoon, someone knocked on the door. 3 firm knocks. They sounded official. I stayed silent, not moving from the bed. Then I heard a voice, a man speaking English with an accent. He said he was police, that he needed to verify my documents. A routine check for foreign visitors. My first impulse was relief. Maybe the station had sent someone after all. But then I remembered that the officer had said they were too busy and that it was not a priority. I stood up slowly and looked through the peephole. A man in a dark uniform was standing in the hallway, but something was wrong. The uniform did not look like the ones the officers at the station had been wearing. It was a different color and had no visible badge. He knocked again and repeated that he needed my passport to verify it, that it would only take a minute. I asked him to slide his identification under the door. There was a pause. Then he said it was not necessary, that I just needed to open the door and it would be quick. His tone had changed. Now he sounded harder, impatient. I told him I would call the station to confirm. Another pause. This one longer. Then footsteps moving away. I watched through the peephole until he disappeared down the stairs. My hands were shaking when I grabbed my phone and tried to find the number for the police station. But when I finally managed to get through, the woman who answered did not understand my English, and I could not get the translation app to work quickly enough. After a few minutes of useless exchange, I hung up. An hour later, maybe a little more, I received another message from Bogdan. This time he wrote that I had to pay additional charges, something about local tourist taxes that were not included in the original booking. He said it was 200 euros and that someone would come collect it that night. I knew it was false. I had researched the area before booking, and there were no charges like that. Nothing close to that amount. I replied that I had already paid everything through the app and would not pay anything else. This time he answered immediately. Just one line. Better you pay. Easier for everyone. I stared at those words for a long time. It was not a suggestion. It was a threat. I looked around the small apartment, the chair still pushed against the door, the window facing the courtyard, my suitcase half packed on the floor. I thought about calling the embassy, but I did not even know if there was one in that country, or how long they would take to do anything. I thought about grabbing my suitcase and running to the bus station, spending the night there if necessary. But the bus did not leave until 7 in the morning, and I did not know if the station stayed open all night or if it was safe to stay there. Around 9 at night they arrived. I heard them before I saw anything. Footsteps on the stairs. More than one person. Then they stopped in front of my door. A soft knock, almost polite. Then a voice I recognized. The same accent as the fake police officer, but different, rougher. He said my name, mispronounced it, but close enough. He said they had come to collect what I owed, that I needed to open the door so we could resolve it like adults. I did not answer. I did not move. Another knock, louder this time. Then a second voice, one I had not heard before, said something in their language to the first. I heard a sound like metal touching metal near the lock. They were trying to get in. I grabbed my phone and did the only thing I could think of. I started recording a video, pointed it toward the door, and said loudly in English that I was recording, that I had contacted my embassy, and that other people knew where I was. Complete lies, all of it. But I said it loud and clear. The sound stopped. Silence for maybe 10 seconds, which felt like an hour. Then the first voice spoke again, now calm, almost amused. Okay, no problem. He said to enjoy my stay. Then I heard footsteps going back down, becoming more and more distant until I could no longer hear them. I sat on the floor with my back against the bed, the phone still recording. And I did not move for the rest of the night. I did not sleep. I barely blinked. I just stayed there in the dark, staring at the strip of light under the door, waiting for the shadows to return. They did not return. At 5 in the morning, when the sky started to lighten, I grabbed my suitcase and left everything else behind. The charger, some clothes, a book I had been reading. I did not care. I walked to the bus station through empty streets, jumping at every sound and every person who passed nearby. The station was open. There were a few travelers sitting on benches, half asleep. I found a corner where I could see all the entrances and waited. The bus arrived at 7 exactly on time, and I got on without looking back. I did not feel safe until we crossed the border into the next country, 3 hours later. Even then, I kept looking behind me. I kept expecting to see the tall man in the dark jacket or the one with the shaved head, but they were gone. Or maybe they simply found someone else. I never reported it to anyone, not formally. Who was I supposed to report it to? The police were useless or involved in something. The rental platform sent me a generic response when I complained. Something about investigating the matter. And the listing stayed active for months afterward when I checked it. Bogdan even left me a review. 1 star, saying I was a difficult guest who left without paying what I owed. I did not respond. I just deleted my account and tried to forget any of it had happened. But I still think about those footsteps stopping in front of my door. I still hear that voice saying my name, and I still wonder what would have happened if I had opened. Story 4. Renting out the basement of my house seemed like the smartest financial decision after my divorce was officially finalized in early 2023. My daughter had just started college at Ohio State, and between tuition payments and the mortgage on a house I probably should have sold, the extra money from short-term rentals felt like a lifeline. The basement suite was perfect for it. It had a private entrance through the side door, its own bathroom, and a small kitchenette I had installed myself over a weekend. My friends from the fire station where I worked as an emergency dispatcher thought I was crazy for letting strangers sleep about 15 feet below my bedroom. But after hosting maybe 40 or 50 guests over 8 months without a single problem, I came to believe I had the system under control. Background checks, verified profiles, and a strict no parties rule written in bold in the listing. What could go wrong with a couple booking a weekend for a work trip? They arrived on a Friday afternoon in late October, and I remember thinking they looked almost too normal. The man introduced himself as Craig. He was probably in his 40s, with a firm handshake and one of those forgettable faces that seem pulled from insurance commercials. The woman with him said her name was Tamara. She barely held eye contact. She only smiled politely while clutching a leather travel bag against her chest, as if she had something valuable inside. They were driving a silver Nissan Altima with Kentucky plates. Nothing flashy, nothing suspicious. I gave them the usual tour. I showed them how the thermostat worked, pointed out the fire extinguisher under the sink, because old habits die hard, and explained the basics. Craig asked about the neighborhood, whether it was quiet at night. I told him it was the most boring street in Columbus. Nothing ever happened there. He laughed. A short, small laugh that seemed genuine enough at the time. I handed them the keys, wished them a good stay, and went upstairs to heat leftover pasta while watching the Buckeyes lose another game. If I had paid more attention to the way Tamara kept looking at the windows, measuring them with her eyes, maybe I would have understood what was coming. Friday night passed without incident. I heard them moving around downstairs. Normal sounds, footsteps, the television murmuring through the floor, water running through the pipes. Saturday morning I left early for a 12-hour shift at the station. When I returned around 11 at night, the house was dark and quiet. I assumed they had gone to bed early. maybe tired from whatever had brought them to the city for work. I made myself a sandwich, answered some texts from my daughter complaining about her roommate, and fell into a deep sleep. It was around 2 in the morning when the thudding woke me. It was not exactly loud, but it was rhythmic, as if someone were moving furniture or dragging something heavy across the basement floor. I lay there for a few minutes staring at the ceiling, telling myself it was nothing. People move around at night, especially in unfamiliar places. But then I heard voices, not just 2 voices, but several, overlapping one another. A low murmur of conversation interrupted by occasional laughter. I sat up in bed and checked my phone, half expecting to find a message from Craig apologizing for inviting someone over. Nothing. I put on sweatpants and walked to the back of the house, where I had installed a small security monitor that showed footage from 3 cameras: the front porch, the backyard, and the side door that led to the basement entrance. The porch was empty, just my truck parked in the driveway under the streetlight. The backyard showed nothing but shadows and the old swing set my daughter had loved when she was little. But the side door camera made me sit on the edge of the bed and stare. People were entering one after another. I counted at least a dozen in the span of 2 minutes. Men and women. Some carried bags. Others carried nothing. They all disappeared around the corner toward the basement door. None of them looked toward the camera. They knew exactly where they were going, as if they had done it before. I saw a guy in a black hoodie hold the door open with a brick so it would not close, making it easier for anyone else who came after him to get in. My listing clearly stated that the maximum was 2 guests. I had charged Craig for 2 people, and now there were at least 15 strangers in my basement with no idea what they were doing down there. I spent the next hour debating what to do. Part of me wanted to go downstairs immediately and demand that everyone leave. But another part, the part that had worked in emergency services long enough to know how quickly a situation can turn violent, told me to wait until morning. These were not college kids throwing a party. The people I saw on the camera moved with intention, quietly, in an organized way. Around 3:30, the thudding stopped and the voices went completely silent. I finally fell into a light sleep with my phone clutched in my hand and the security app still open. When I woke at 7 with the pale Sunday light coming through the blinds, I went straight to the back window overlooking the yard. What I saw forced me to grab the frame to keep my balance. The lawn was covered in trash. Beer bottles, plastic cups, fast food wrappers scattered everywhere like confetti after a parade. But that was not the worst part. Near the fence, maybe 10 feet from my daughter's old swing set, there was a black circle burned into the grass, almost 3 feet wide. Fire marks. And in the center of the circle were melted remnants of fabric. Maybe clothing. Maybe sheets. Twisted, unrecognizable shapes. I put on shoes and went outside, not even bothering to look for a jacket, though the October cold bit through my t-shirt. The smell hit me before I reached the burn spot. It was chemical, acrid, very different from a normal campfire. I crouched beside the melted fabric, trying to understand what it had been. There were buttons mixed with the ashes and something that looked like a zipper fused into a crooked line of metal. Someone had deliberately burned clothing there in the middle of the night while I slept 15 feet above. I took out my phone and photographed everything. The trash, the burn marks, the bottles. Then I noticed they were not only beer bottles. There were also empty containers of isopropyl alcohol and acetone. My hands were steady, but something inside my chest was vibrating at a frequency I could not control. I walked toward the side door, which was still open because of the brick, and stopped in front of the basement door. Sounds came from inside. Soft footsteps. Someone speaking in a low voice. I knocked hard 3 times using the side of my fist, the way I had learned when I was a volunteer firefighter before moving into dispatch. Craig opened the door about 6 inches, just enough for me to see half his face. He looked different than he had on Friday. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw tight, and there was a hardness in his expression that had not been there before. Behind him, I caught sight of Tamara sitting on the edge of the bed. Beside her was a man I had never seen before, heavy-set, with a shaved head and tattoos climbing up his neck. The smell coming from inside was wrong. a mixture of sweat and something chemical that reminded me of the burned pile in the yard. I told Craig we needed to talk about what had happened the night before, that I had cameras, that I had seen everything. He did not blink. He just looked at me with a flat, empty expression and said that whatever I thought I had seen, I needed to forget it. I told him that was not going to happen, that they had violated the rental agreement and had to leave before noon or I would call the police. That was when Craig leaned toward me, close enough that I could smell cigarettes and something sour on his breath. Then he said 5 words I still hear perfectly when I close my eyes at night. "Don't interfere with the business." Then he shut the door in my face, and I heard the deadbolt slide into place. The deadbolt I had installed myself was now being used to lock me out of my own property. I went upstairs and called the police non-emergency line, thinking this was a civil matter, an eviction situation at worst. The officer who arrived 40 minutes later was young, maybe in his 20s, with that disinterested politeness that made it clear he had already decided this was not worth much of his time. I showed him the photos on my phone. I took him to the backyard so he could see the burned patch in the trash. I explained the cameras and the crowd of people I had seen entering in the middle of the night. He nodded, took a few notes, and then knocked on the basement door. Craig opened it with a completely different attitude, friendly, apologetic, laughing about how they had invited a few friends over and things had gotten a little out of hand. He called it a disagreement over a party, a misunderstanding between neighbors. He said they would clean the yard and leave at checkout time on Monday morning. The officer looked at me as if I was the one causing trouble. He told me that since they had a valid rental agreement until Monday morning, there was not much he could do unless I had proof of a crime. I mentioned the chemical containers, the burned clothing, but without proof of exactly what had been burned or why. Everything was speculation. The officer left his card and told me to call if things escalated, though his tone made it clear he did not expect to hear from me again. I spent the rest of Sunday afternoon in the living room, watching the security cameras on my laptop with the blinds closed. The basement stayed quiet most of the day, but I saw Craig and the bald man leave around 4 in the afternoon and get into a white cargo van I had never seen before. It was not the silver Altima they had arrived in. They left and did not return for hours. Tamara stayed behind. Through the thin walls, I could hear her talking on the phone. Her voice was too muffled to make out words, but the tone was urgent, almost frantic at times. I thought about calling my daughter just to hear a familiar voice. But what was I going to say? That I had rented my basement to criminals? That I was sitting in my own house feeling like a prisoner? Around 8, when the sun had already set and the street had fallen into that Sunday stillness, I looked at the front porch camera and felt my throat tighten. There were 2 men standing at the end of my driveway, right where the concrete met the sidewalk. They were not moving. They were not speaking to each other. They were just standing there, hands in their jacket pockets, staring directly at the house. One was tall and thin, with a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. The other was shorter, broader, with a beard that caught the orange glow of the street lamp. I had never seen either of them before. I watched them for almost 20 minutes, waiting for them to do something. Approach the house, leave, anything. But they remained still, eyes fixed on my front windows, as if waiting for a signal. I turned off every light in the house and moved through my own home in the dark like an intruder. I positioned myself near a window where I could see them without them seeing me. At some point, the tall man took out his phone, looked at the screen, and showed it to the other one. Both looked back toward the house, and I swear the shorter one smiled. Just a quick flash of teeth that disappeared as soon as it appeared. Then, as if they had received an invisible order, they both turned and walked down the sidewalk, disappearing into the shadows between the streetlights. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my recliner with a baseball bat across my lap, the same one my daughter had used in Little League 15 years earlier, and watched the cameras until my eyes burned. The white van returned around midnight. I saw Craig and the bald man carry something into the basement, something wrapped in black plastic that required both of them to lift it. I told myself it could be anything. Equipment, supplies, furniture. I told myself many things that night that I did not believe. Monday morning was gray and cold. One of those Ohio fall days where it feels like the sky itself is pressing down on you. Checkout was scheduled for 11, and at 10:30 there was no sign of movement in the basement. I called the rental platform's emergency line and explained the situation. The unauthorized guests, the threats, the men watching my house. The representative put me on hold for 15 minutes and then came back with nothing useful. He only promised to investigate and reminded me that I could file a property damage claim. At noon, Craig and Tamara were still inside. I could hear them moving. I heard that same low murmur of voices that now included at least 2 or 3 other people. Then I made a decision. Probably stupid in retrospect, but I had gone a night without sleep and was running on adrenaline alone. I grabbed my phone, started recording video, and used my master key to open the basement door. The smell hit me first. Stronger chemicals than before, mixed with something organic and rotten underneath. The living area looked as if it had exploded. Mattresses on the floor, trash everywhere, bottles, cans, and food containers piled in the corners. But it was the back room, the small storage space where I kept Christmas decorations. That left me breathless. There were plastic containers lined up against the wall, the kind you buy at hardware stores, with handwritten labels I could not read from where I stood. The windows had been covered with black plastic sheeting, and someone had installed locks on the inside, improvised latches that could keep someone either out or in. Craig appeared from the bathroom. Behind him I saw the bald man and another guy I did not recognize, younger with nervous eyes that kept darting toward the back room. Craig told me to leave. His voice was calm, but it had an edge that felt like a blade against my throat. I raised my phone and told him I had already called the police again, that they were on their way, that whatever they were doing down there was over. It was a bluff. I had not called anyone yet, but something in my voice must have convinced him. He looked at the other 2 men, and some kind of silent communication passed between them. Then he smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who knows something you do not. He told me to check the wall beside the bed before making threats again. Then all 3 of them walked past me, so close that the bald man's shoulder brushed mine, and went out through the side door without another word. I heard car doors slam, an engine start, and then they were gone. I stood there in that destroyed basement, my phone still recording, and walked to the wall Craig had mentioned. Someone had scratched words into the drywall with something sharp, deep grooves that cut through the paint and into the plaster underneath. 5 words I can still see when I close my eyes. "We know you live upstairs." This time I called the police for real. Not the non-emergency line, but 911, and I told them everything. First 2 officers arrived, then a detective, then an entire team of plainclothes people who, after seeing the back room, made everyone else step outside. They found traces of methamphetamine production in the containers, enough chemical residue to charge someone with manufacturing if they ever managed to catch them. The black plastic over the windows, the locks, the burned clothing in the yard. Everything pointed to a mobile drug operation, the kind that sets up in temporary rentals for a few days and disappears before anyone realizes. The detective told me I had been lucky, that these people had done this in other cities, that property owners who asked too many questions usually ended up with something worse than a message scratched into the wall. They took fingerprints, samples, and photos of everything. But Craig and Tamara, if those were even their real names, had used fake documents to make the reservation. The silver Altima had been stolen from a parking lot in Kentucky 3 weeks earlier. The white van was found abandoned 2 days later at a rest area near Indianapolis, completely wiped clean. No one was ever arrested. The case went cold in less than a month. I sold the house in February 2024, at a loss just to get out quickly. My daughter asked why I was moving into an apartment when I had always said I would die in that house. I told her I just needed a change of scenery. I never told her about the message on the wall, or the men standing at the end of the driveway, or the nights I spent awake with a bat, waiting for footsteps that never came. There are things you carry alone because sharing them would only pass part of the weight to the people you love. I still look behind me when I walk to my car at night. I still watch every silver Nissan on the highway and wonder, The new apartment does not have a basement. It does not have extra rooms. There is no space for guests of any kind. Sometimes I wake up at 2 in the morning and lie there in the dark, listening for thuds through walls that do not exist, voices that are not there. The police told me those people probably forgot about me the moment they left, that I was just another stop, another temporary mark on the criminal road they move along. Maybe that is true. But I remember the way Craig smiled before leaving, how he told me to check the wall as if he were giving me a gift. They wanted me to find that message. They wanted me to know that even in my own house, I was never really alone. And some nights when the apartment is too quiet and the shadows stretch too long, I still do not feel alone. That is the part that keeps me from sleeping. Story 5. After 7 years surviving one tax season after another at an accounting firm in Denver, I had finally done it. I had saved enough for a real trip. Not a weekend getaway to Las Vegas or a cruise with watered-down drinks, but a real adventure alone through Portugal. My sister thought I was crazy for traveling by myself at 26, but something about the idea of walking through cobblestone streets with no itinerary felt like the reset I desperately needed. I landed in Lisbon on a Wednesday morning in late September 2024. I was exhausted from jet lag, but vibrating with that specific kind of excitement that only appears when everything around you is unfamiliar. The plan was simple. Spend 3 days in the capital, then go to Porto for 4 more, and finally fly back home. I had booked accommodations through Airbnb, choosing places that seemed authentic rather than touristy. For Porto, I found what looked like a bargain, a private room inside a 19th century townhouse in the Ribera district, run by a man named Gaspar. It had dozens of 5-star reviews praising his hospitality and local recommendations. When I arrived at the address that Sunday afternoon, the house exceeded my expectations in a way that made me almost euphoric. It was on a narrow street climbing up from the Douro River, with blue and white tiles shining under the autumn sun. Gaspar greeted me at the heavy wooden door with a warm handshake and a smile that wrinkled the corners of his eyes. He was maybe in his early 60s. He had thick gray hair combed back and a carefully trimmed beard that gave him an almost grandfatherly appearance. His English was broken but enthusiastic, sprinkled with Portuguese phrases that he then translated with exaggerated hand gestures. He insisted on carrying my suitcase up the creaking staircase while pointing out family photographs on the walls, his late wife, his daughter who lived in Brazil, his grandchildren whom he only saw through video calls. The room was charming. High ceilings with exposed wooden beams, a wrought iron bed covered with spotless white sheets, and a window overlooking a tiny courtyard full of potted lemon trees. He handed me an ornate bronze key and then, almost as if remembering at the last moment, mentioned that he would keep a copy in the kitchen drawer for safety in case I ever locked myself out. The first 2 days were like a dream. I walked through Livraria Lello, at Francesinha in a tiny restaurant where the owner kissed my cheeks as if I were family, and watched the sunset paint the Douro in copper and pink tones. Gaspar was attentive in a way that at first seemed sweet. Every morning over coffee, he asked about my plans, recommended hidden places, and warned me about pickpockets near the train station. But by the second night, his questions became more specific. Where exactly was I going? What time would I be back? Had I told anyone back home that I was staying there? I attributed it to a cultural difference, maybe even the loneliness of an old man whose family lived across the ocean. When I mentioned that I was going to dinner with a group of people I had met at a hostel in Lisbon, he frowned slightly and said it was dangerous for a woman to walk alone after dark. He offered to wait up for me to make sure I got back safely. I thanked him, but declined the offer, laughing nervously as I grabbed my jacket and stepped out into the cool night air. That night I came back earlier than expected, around 9:30 instead of 11, because one of the girls in the group got food poisoning and everyone decided to end the night early. The narrow street was quiet except for the blue glow of a television in a neighbor's window. I opened the front door as quietly as possible, not wanting to disturb Gaspar if he had already gone to sleep. But as I climbed the stairs, I heard footsteps upstairs. quick, shuffling. Then came the unmistakable creak of my bedroom door. My heart started hammering against my ribs when I reached the landing. There, standing in the doorway of my room, with my backpack pressed against his chest, was Gaspar. For one instant, neither of us moved. His expression passed through several emotions. Surprise, something that almost looked like fear, then a smile that spread across his face too slowly. He explained in a voice that was far too casual that he had noticed my window did not close properly and wanted to check it before the rain came. He set my backpack on the bed, patted it twice as if it were a sleeping pet, and wished me good night before passing me in the hallway. I stood there for what felt like minutes, my pulse pounding in my ears, trying to convince myself that I had completely misunderstood the situation. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the old house made me wake with a start. I found myself staring at the space under the door, waiting to see shadows. I had pushed the heavy wooden dresser against the door before getting into bed, telling myself I was being paranoid, that Gaspar was just a strange old man, but harmless. When morning light finally slipped through the curtains, I checked the backpack and everything seemed to be in place. My passport, my wallet, the emergency cash hidden in a zippered pocket inside my toiletry bag. Nothing was missing. I almost laughed at myself, the dramatic American girl who had watched too many true crime documentaries. I decided to stay the remaining 2 nights as planned, but keep my distance from Gaspar. Spend more time outside the house. Maybe find a cafe with Wi-Fi where I could edit the hundreds of photos filling my phone. I picked up my phone from the nightstand to check my messages, and that was when I noticed it. The small side tray of the device was slightly open. When I pulled it out, the slot was empty. My SIM card, my only connection for making calls and sending messages without Wi-Fi, was placed neatly on the wooden desk across the room, propped against the base of a ceramic lamp, as if someone had left it there deliberately for me to find. My mind searched for logical explanations. Maybe I had taken it out myself and forgotten. Maybe it somehow fell out and Gaspar found it on the floor and left it there for me. But I knew none of those things were true. I remembered using the phone to text my sister right before falling asleep. I remembered the little green bubble confirming the message had sent. Someone had removed that SIM card while I slept, while the dresser blocked the door. That meant they had moved the furniture without waking me, or they had entered from somewhere else. I walked to the window and examined the latch. It was old, the kind that could be forced with a butter knife, and the frame had faint scratches I had not noticed before. A knot formed in my stomach so tight I thought I would vomit. I put the SIM back into the phone with trembling fingers and immediately tried to call a taxi to the airport. I did not care about the remaining nights I had paid for. I did not care about the non-refundable reservation or the carefully planned itinerary. I just needed to get out of that house, that street, that city that had transformed from charming to suffocating in a single night. The first taxi I requested through the app accepted the ride. I watched the little car icon move across the screen toward my location. I started throwing clothes into my suitcase without folding them, stuffing toiletries into side pockets without worrying about order, wrinkles, or the packing habits that normally obsessed me. Then about 3 minutes before arrival, the driver canceled. No explanation, just a notification that my ride was no longer available. I requested another. A different driver accepted, and again I watched the icon approach on the map, getting closer and closer until it was practically on top of my pin. Then he canceled too. I tried a third time with the same result. Acceptance, approach, cancellation. On the fourth attempt, I saw the car actually turn onto my street, stop for almost a minute, and then make a sharp U-turn before the cancellation notification appeared. I stood at the window looking at the narrow street. My closed suitcase waited by the door, and I watched the white sedan disappear around the corner as if it were fleeing from something. I switched to another taxi app, one of the local Portuguese ones I had downloaded as a backup. The first driver who accepted sent me a message almost immediately. "This address, are you sure?" I answered. "Yes, please hurry." He canceled 30 seconds later without saying anything else. Finally, I went downstairs thinking maybe I could walk to a busier street and get a taxi the old-fashioned way. Gaspar was sitting at the kitchen table with a newspaper spread open in front of him and a small cup of espresso steaming beside his elbow. He looked up when I appeared with the suitcase, and something crossed his face. Not exactly surprise, more like resigned disappointment, like a father catching a teenager trying to sneak out after curfew. He asked if I was leaving early. I told him there was a family emergency back home and I needed to catch the next flight to Denver. He nodded slowly, folding the newspaper with deliberate care. He said it was very unfortunate because the neighborhood had been having some problems lately. Problems with what? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He waved his hand vaguely and mentioned something about robberies, strangers asking questions, and how it was not safe for a young woman to walk alone with luggage. He offered to call someone for me, a friend with a car who could take me to the airport for a fair price. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to refuse, to walk out that door and take my chances in the street. But the memory of the 4 canceled taxis, of that white sedan fleeing as if my address were cursed, made me hesitate long enough for Gaspar to pick up his phone and dial. He spoke in fast Portuguese, too fast for me to catch more than a few words. Americana, aeroporto, agora. When he hung up, he smiled and told me his friend would arrive in about an hour, that I should relax and have tea while I waited. An hour felt like an eternity, but what choice did I have? I sat in the living room with my suitcase beside me like a loyal dog, refusing the tea he offered me 3 separate times. Gaspar settled into an armchair across from me and watched a soccer match on a small television mounted in the corner, although I noticed his eyes kept drifting toward me, toward the front door, and toward the window facing the street. The afternoon light began to fade and the wait stretched into 2 hours. I asked about his friend, and he assured me he was coming. That traffic in Porto was terrible, that I should be patient. By the time the sun sank behind the terracotta rooftops, I knew no one was coming to take me to the airport. I stood and announced that I would walk to the main avenue to find transportation on my own. Gaspar got up from his chair faster than I would have believed possible for a man his age and placed himself between the door and me. His hands raised in a gesture probably meant to be calming, but which felt like a wall. Outside, dogs began barking. Not 1 or 2. It sounded as if every dog in the neighborhood had joined a chorus of frantic barking that rose and fell in waves. I moved to the window and pulled the lace curtain aside. What I saw stole my breath. There were 2 cars parked on the narrow street below. Both were dark sedans with their engines running, sending white exhaust into the cold evening air. I could make out silhouettes inside. 2 people in the first car, at least 3 in the second, though their features were hidden by the fading light and the tinted windows. They were not moving. They were not getting out. They were just waiting. I turned to Gaspar and demanded that he tell me who they were, what was happening, why I could not leave. He looked at me with an expression I will never forget, a mixture of pity and fear that seemed genuine, and that suddenly made him look very old and very tired. He shuffled toward the staircase and gestured for me to follow him back to my room. When I refused, he leaned close enough for me to smell the coffee on his breath and the faint stale odor of his wool sweater. He lowered his voice to a whisper barely audible and said the words that still echo in my nightmares. "You cannot leave tonight. There are people asking about you." I grabbed his arm and demanded answers. Who was asking? What did they want? What had he done? Gaspar pulled away and sank into a chair like a man defeated by something much larger than himself. In broken English mixed with Portuguese that I could barely follow, he explained that he owed money to certain people. People who did not accept no for an answer. People who noticed when young foreign women with American passports stayed alone in houses they controlled. He swore he had not wanted any of it to happen, that he had only mentioned me in passing, that he thought they only wanted to look at my documents to see if I was worth something. Worth something. Those words hung in the air like poison. He said the men outside had been watching since the day before, that they had connections with the taxi companies, that the whole neighborhood knew it was better not to get involved. I felt the walls closing in around me. I felt the old house stop being a charming memory and become a cage with blue tiles and lemon trees. But underneath the terror, something else ignited. A cold, sharp fury that cut through the panic and left me thinking with terrible clarity. I told Gaspar I needed to use the bathroom. He nodded wearily, too broken to suspect anything. I locked myself in the small bathroom beside the kitchen, took out my phone and connected to his Wi-Fi. My fingers flew across the screen as I opened every app I could think of. I messaged the United States Embassy emergency line on Facebook. I emailed the consulate with my location and a desperate plea for help. I posted in a traveler's safety group with my exact address and a photo of the street I had taken days earlier. I sent my sister a voice message explaining everything in case it was the last thing she ever heard from me. Then I did something that probably saved my life. I found the emergency contact for the local Porto police online and sent them a WhatsApp message with a photo of my passport, my pinned location, and a desperate explanation that I was being held against my will by people who wanted to traffic me. I did not know if they would respond. I did not know if WhatsApp was even a legitimate way to contact authorities. But I had nothing left to lose. I stayed in that bathroom for almost 40 minutes, refreshing the messages, listening to the muffled sounds of Gaspar walking through the kitchen and the dog still barking outside. And then, like a miracle, I heard sirens, first distant, then closer, then right outside the window. I heard car doors slamming, engines revving, and tires screeching. As the dark sedans fled into the night, I heard shouting in Portuguese, Gaspar's voice high and terrified, and heavy footsteps climbing the stairs. When the police knocked on the bathroom door and said in accented English that I was safe, I collapsed onto the cold tile floor and cried harder than I have ever cried in my life. They got me out of that house in less than an hour, took my statement at the station until almost 3 a.m, and put me on a flight back to Denver the next afternoon, with a police escort all the way to the gate. I never found out exactly who those men were, or what would have happened if the sirens had not arrived. Gaspar was arrested, although I do not know what charges stuck or whether he is still in prison. What I do know is that I have not traveled alone since. I know that I checked the locks of my apartment 4 times before sleeping, and I know that sometimes, when a car idles too long on my street, I feel that same frozen fear close around my chest like a fist. I survived something that night in Porto, something I still do not fully understand. And the only reason I am here to tell this story is because I trusted my instincts and fought with the only weapon I had, a phone, in the desperate hope that someone somewhere was listening. Story 6. My company sent me to Austin for a software training conference in March 2018. 4 days, all expenses paid. It sounded good until I saw the hotel options they had approved. $60 a night in downtown Austin gets you a room that smells like cigarette smoke and despair. So I did what most people my age do now and booked a rental apartment. I found a pretty nice place about 6 blocks from the convention center. Modern building, excellent reviews. Managed by a guy named Craig who had more than 200 5-star ratings. The listing photos showed a sleek 1-bedroom unit with floor-to-ceiling windows, a kitchen island with stools, and a sofa bed in the living room. $90 a night. Much better than the approved motels. I messaged Craig a few questions about check-in. He replied within minutes. Very friendly. It seemed like a solid option. My girlfriend even joked that she wished she could come with me because the place looked better than our actual apartment in Columbus. I arrived in Austin around 3 in the afternoon after a connection through Dallas. Craig had installed one of those keypad locks, so I just entered the code he had sent by message and went inside. The apartment looked exactly like the photos, which is always a relief with these rentals. Clean, modern, with that generic IKEA furniture aesthetic, but in a good way. Large windows overlooking an interior courtyard and plenty of natural light. I set my suitcase in the bedroom, checked the bathroom, opened the refrigerator to see if anything was inside. The usual, some condiment packets, bottled water, a welcome note on the counter with the Wi-Fi password and restaurant recommendations. I remember thinking it was going to be a quiet trip. I had the rest of the afternoon free before the conference started the next morning, so I planned to have dinner somewhere nearby and maybe walk around a little. That was the plan. Anyway, I wish I had stayed in a miserable hotel. I came back from dinner around 8, full after some pretty decent barbecue at a place a few blocks away. The sun was setting, and the apartment had that orange glow coming through the windows. I took off my shoes, grabbed a beer from the welcome pack Craig had left in the fridge, and settled onto the sofa bed to watch something on my laptop. That was when I first noticed the motion sensors. There were 3 installed at different points in the main room. Small white rectangular boxes about the size of a deck of cards. One near the front door, another in the hallway leading to the bedroom, and another mounted on the wall beside the kitchen island, maybe 6 feet high. I assumed they were part of the security system, the kind that triggers an alarm if someone breaks in. The listing mentioned that the building had good security features, so I did not give it much thought. But I remember looking at the one beside the kitchen and noticing that its small LED light blinked green every few seconds. The other 2 had steady red lights, no blinking. I thought maybe it was another model or something like that. I gave it no more than a casual glance. Around 11, while I was getting ready for bed, the electricity in the apartment flickered. Just for a second. The lights went out and came back on. Probably nothing strange in an old building, except this place was supposedly recently renovated. I was in the kitchen pouring myself a glass of water when I noticed the sensor beside the island again. The power had just gone out for a moment, but the green light was still blinking. Same rhythm, same interval. That seemed strange to me. If the electricity had gone out even for a second, shouldn't the sensor restart or shut off? I stood there looking at it for maybe 30 seconds. It stayed the same. Blink, pause, blink, pause. I went over to the sensor by the front door. Its red light had gone steady again after the flicker, as if it had reset. Same with the one in the hallway, but the kitchen one kept blinking as if nothing had happened. I am not a naturally paranoid person, but that inconsistency stuck in my head. I told myself it probably had a backup battery or was a different brand. I went to bed, but I kept thinking about that blinking light in the dark. The next morning I woke up early around 6, even though my first conference session did not start until 9. I made coffee with the small machine on the counter and found myself staring at that sensor again. In daylight I could see it better. It looked newer than the other 2. The plastic was brighter, less dusty. The other sensors had that slightly yellowish tone that white devices get after a couple of years. This one looked recently installed. I pulled one of the stools over and climbed up to inspect it closely. The sensor by the door had a small logo, some security brand I did not recognize, and a label with a serial number. The hallway one was the same, but the kitchen one was different. No logo, no serial number. Just a plain white casing with a small dark circle in the center that I had not noticed before. I remember my heart starting to beat faster when I saw that circle. It was about the size of a pencil eraser, slightly recessed into the plastic. I told myself it was probably a light sensor or infrared detector. Motion sensors have those things, right? But why did this one look so different from the others? I climbed down from the stool and picked up my phone. I searched the brand on the other sensors and found the security company's website. They made basic home equipment, motion detectors, door alarms, things like that. I checked their catalog and found models that matched the door and hallway sensors perfectly. Then I searched for one that matched the kitchen unit. Nothing. Not a single product on their page looked like that plain white box with the dark circle. I went back to the apartment listing and reread the description. Craig had written that the unit included a smart security system with motion detection. I checked the photos and found one image of the living room taken from an angle that showed the kitchen area. I zoomed in as much as my phone would allow. The photo had to be about a year old based on the listing date. In that image, there was no sensor installed beside the kitchen island, just bare wall. My mouth went dry. That sensor had been added sometime in the last year, and it was not the same brand as the rest of the system. I skipped breakfast. I was supposed to be at the convention center in 2 hours, but I could not stop thinking about that device on the wall. I pulled the stool over again and climbed up. This time I turned on my phone's flashlight and aimed the light directly at the small dark circle. My stomach turned. Through the tiny opening I saw the unmistakable glint of glass. A lens. I had worked briefly at an electronics store during college, and I knew what camera lenses looked like, even miniature ones. That was not a motion sensor. I climbed down and sat on the stool for a while, trying to process it. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe Craig had a legitimate reason. Maybe it was for security in case of break-ins. But why hide it? Why make it look like part of the system? And why point it directly at the living room where the sofa bed was, where I had been sitting in my underwear the night before watching videos on my laptop? I felt sick, literally sick, like I was going to vomit. I went to the bathroom and splashed water on my face, trying to calm down and think clearly. I decided I needed to be sure before doing anything drastic. I grabbed a butter knife from the kitchen drawer and climbed back onto the stool. The device was attached with 2 small Phillips head screws, nothing complicated. I hesitated for a second, wondering whether I had the right to tamper with the host property. Then I thought about someone watching me sleep and stopped caring about the deposit. The screws came out easily. Too easily, as if they had already been removed before. The device detached from the wall and sat in my hands. It was light, only a few ounces. I turned it over and found a small label on the back with a model number and a brand I recognized immediately. NannyCam Pro. I had seen ads for those cameras online, marketed to parents who want to watch babysitters or people who suspect their partner is cheating. Wireless, battery-powered, connected to an app for watching the live feed from a phone. The battery explained why it kept blinking during the power outage. That was not connected to the apartment's security system at all. It was transmitting video to someone's phone, and that someone had placed it to capture everything happening on the sofa bed and in the kitchen area. I took photos of everything: the device, the label, the spot on the wall where it had been installed, and the screws. I even recorded a video of myself turning the camera around to show the NannyCam Pro brand. My hands were not steady, but I got the material I needed. Then I sat down and messaged Craig through the app. I was direct. I told him I had found a hidden camera in the living room and asked him for an explanation. He replied in 5 minutes, which told me he had probably seen me remove it from the wall through the live feed. His message was calm, almost rehearsed. He said I must be confused, that it was just a heat sensor for the smart thermostat system. Nothing to worry about. He even added a smiley face at the end. A smiley face. I replied that I had removed it and found the nanny camera label on the back. There was a long pause, maybe 10 minutes, where he did not answer. I stared at the phone, waiting. When he finally replied, his tone had changed. He said the previous tenant must have installed it and that he had no idea it was there. He apologized for the confusion and offered me a partial refund for the inconvenience. I almost laughed at that response. The previous tenant had installed a wireless camera that was still actively transmitting to some device, and Craig had no idea. The thing was blinking green, clearly powered on and working, and his first response had been to say it was a heat sensor, not that he did not know it existed. He changed his story as soon as I proved I knew what it was. I told him I was not interested in a partial refund and that I was going to report it to the police. He started calling me immediately. 5 calls in a row. I did not answer. He sent more messages saying we could work it out, that there was no need to involve anyone else, that he would refund my entire stay and give me credit for a future reservation. The desperation in his messages made my skin crawl. That was not the reaction of someone who had just learned there was a camera in his property. It was the reaction of someone trying to make a problem disappear. I blocked his number and called the Austin Police Department's non-emergency line. The woman who answered sounded tired but became alert when I explained what I had found. She told me to stay where I was and that she would send an officer to take the report. 40 minutes later, 2 officers arrived, a man and a woman, both fairly young. I showed them the camera, the photos, and Craig's messages. The female officer, whose badge said Fuentes, examined the device and nodded slowly, as if she had seen something like it before. She told me hidden cameras and short-term rentals were becoming a growing problem, that they received several reports like that each month. She asked whether I had changed clothes in the living room or done anything private there. I thought about the night before, about how I had stayed in boxers because the apartment was hot, about how I had had a video call with my girlfriend before sleeping while sitting on the sofa. My face must have gone pale because Officer Fuentes put a hand on my shoulder and told me they would take it seriously. They confiscated the camera as evidence and took my statement. The male officer made some calls and discovered Craig owned 3 other rentals in Austin, 3 more apartments where he could have done the same thing. They told me to find another place to stay for the rest of the trip and that a detective would contact me in the coming days. I packed my suitcase in about 4 minutes and got out of there. I ended up in a chain hotel near the airport, $70 a night, ugly carpet and all. I did not care. I checked every corner of the room twice before even sitting on the bed. The detective called me 2 weeks later, when I was already back in Columbus. She told me they had executed a search warrant at Craig's house and found external hard drives with recordings from several properties over almost 2 years, hundreds of hours of video. Guests sleeping, getting dressed, being intimate with their partners. She could not tell me whether I appeared in any recordings. She said it was part of an ongoing investigation. Craig was arrested and charged with multiple counts of voyeurism, but I never found out what happened after that. I searched news reports, court records, anything. His name never appeared in public reports. Maybe he took a deal. Maybe the case is still pending. Honestly, I do not know. What I do know is that I think about that little blinking green light more than I would like to admit. In every hotel, every rental, every guest room at friends' houses, I find myself checking walls and ceilings before I can relax. My girlfriend and I went to a cabin in Michigan last fall, and I spent the first hour unscrewing smoke detectors and looking behind mirrors. She says I have become paranoid. Maybe she is right. But someone watched me in my underwear, saw me sleep, saw me have a private video call with the person I love. And there may be a recording of that on some hard drive inside an evidence room in Texas. That is not paranoia. That is simply knowing what people are capable of when they think no one is paying attention. Story 7. A bag full of camera equipment and a deadline hanging over me pushed me to book a last-minute stay in an old restored carriage house attached to an old property. At the time, my life was an uneven mix of shoots, edits, and travel, and I had already gotten used to working from whatever room I ended up in. The place had that carefully constructed historic charm. Exposed beams, polished floors, the smell of furniture wax floating in the air. The only thing that did not quite fit was a wooden panel hanging on the wall across from the bed. Everything else looked like it belonged in a boutique design magazine, but that panel had a dull, uneven finish, as if it had been hand-carved and forgotten for decades. I remember thinking it looked mounted, but not in a design way, more like someone wanted it there for a reason they were not explaining. I had unpacked just enough to prepare for a video call with a client, trying to adjust the lighting so I would not look like I was connecting from inside a cave. I moved the lamp a few inches, then a few more. That was when my attention returned to the panel. One of the carved cutouts caught the light in a strange way. It was not a reflection. It was more like something inside the hollow shape had moved for a fraction of a second. At first, I blamed it on the glow from the lamp. But the longer I looked, the more I understood that the faint glimmer was coming from a point deeper than the surface. I felt my chest tighten with that instinctive unease that appears when you notice something that should not be behaving the way it is. I moved closer, telling myself it was probably a draft or a stray shadow. The carvings were strangely intricate. Thin grooves, diamond shapes, small shallow openings that were not symmetrical. Up close, they gave an uncomfortable impression of intentionality that I could not place. I pushed the panel gently, expecting it to be firmly anchored. Instead, it moved about an inch, enough to reveal a narrow opening in the drywall behind it. The opening was not symmetrical either. It looked as if someone had cut from the other side and never bothered to repair it. I inserted my phone flashlight, angling it until the beam passed through the uneven edges. What it illuminated did not look like part of a normal wall. The opening connected to a narrow, unfinished space that ran between the carriage house and the main building. It reminded me of those awkward architectural gaps you only discover when a house has been renovated. Except this one was not empty. Dust covered most of the floor, but near the entrance there were faint footprints, recent enough to distinguish the shape of a heel and part of the arch of a foot. The dust around them was disturbed and continued deeper into the gap. Near the closest footprint, leaning against a beam, was a takeout container from a local restaurant I recognized from the driveway. There was no dust on it. Someone had been there not long before I arrived. Someone small enough or determined enough to crawl through that narrow space, hidden behind a panel placed directly across from the bed. I backed away from the wall, let the panel fall back into place, and tried to make sense of what I had just seen. The room felt different, as if the air had become still in a way I had not noticed before. I went over the details again and again. The disturbed dust, the clear shape of the footprints, the dust-free food container placed there as if someone had left it intending to return. The strangest thing was how deliberate the panel seemed once you really paid attention to it. Its position was not decorative. It was oriented directly toward the bed, with those carved openings arranged in a way that suddenly reminded me of peepholes or observation points. I sat on the edge of the mattress for a moment, listening to the faint settling sounds of the old building. Every creak made me wonder whether it came from the gap and not from the ceiling beams. Finally, I messaged the host through the app, trying to sound calm while explaining what I had found. She replied quickly, almost too quickly. She dismissed everything as a harmless architectural quirk. "Oh, that old construction gap has always been there," she wrote, as if that explained the fresh footprints or the food container that could not have been more than a day old. When I mentioned the panel and how it did not match the rest of the decor, she insisted it was just a touch of historical character. But nothing about it felt historical. The edges were not worn like the beams, and the screws holding it in place looked new. Her casual indifference only made my pulse speed up, because now it seemed like she either did not know the truth or did not want to acknowledge it. I ended the chat more unsettled than before and decided to check the panel again. This time I listened carefully as I pulled it aside. The gap was not wide enough to enter, but the space on the other side extended far enough that someone could move through it. Angling the phone flashlight, I slowly swept the inside, illuminating exposed beams and insulation. A faint glimmer caught my attention deeper inside. Something metallic barely reflected the light, just enough to stand out. I could not reach it, but knowing it was there made everything feel even stranger, as if whoever had been in that space was not only hiding, but also bringing things inside. Looking at that faint reflection, I could not shake the feeling that the panel was not just a cover, it was an observation point. When evening fell, I tried to work on my project, but every so often I caught myself looking at the panel, waiting for another glimmer. The room had darkened into that bluish tone that appears when the sun drops behind the trees, and the carvings seemed to absorb the light instead of reflecting it. At one point, a soft tapping came from the wall, quick, subtle, almost playful. It did not sound like the building settling. It had rhythm, as if someone were making sure I stayed aware of the panel. I set the laptop aside and went completely still, straining to hear anything else. The tapping did not continue, but something inside the gap moved. A small shift, a barely perceptible scrape, enough to confirm I was not imagining it. There was someone in there, and they were waiting for the right moment to move again. Night settled over the property in a way that made the carriage house feel separated from the rest of the world. The estate's exterior lights barely reached my windows, leaving most of the room in a muted half-darkness. I tried to distract myself with editing work, but every sound seemed amplified. The hum of the charger, the faint rattle of old pipes, even the distant breeze moving through the trees outside. I kept looking at that wooden panel, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. But every time I looked, the carvings seemed a little darker, as if the space behind them were absorbing the room's glow. I turned the lamp so it would not point that way, hoping I would not catch another glimmer, but that only made the rest of the wall seem to sink into a deeper shadow. After an hour of trying to ignore the unease creeping into my thoughts, I decided to message a friend who lived several states away. At first, I did not give her all the details. I only told her the rental had some weird construction things, and that the energy of the room felt wrong. She asked if the place had good reviews. I told her yes, although at that moment I started wondering how many people had actually inspected the walls. As we talked, I kept walking between the bed and the small kitchen, not allowing my back to face the panel for too long. Halfway through typing a message, I heard a soft scraping from inside the wall. It was not loud or aggressive, just enough to cut off my breath. The timing felt deliberate, as if whoever was inside knew I was trying to contact someone. I moved closer again, phone in hand, and leaned toward the carvings. The panel did not move, but the temperature near that part of the wall was noticeably colder, as if air were passing from a deeper draft inside the gap. I pointed my phone camera at one of the carved openings, hoping to catch something on the other side. Instead, the screen reflected a shape I had not expected. The faint outline of another object placed behind the panel, angled toward the room. At first, I thought it was some kind of bracket, but then I understood the shape was too clean, too symmetrical. It looked like a small plastic housing, the kind used for cheap lenses or peephole kits. It was not built into the wall. It had been added. Then a slow, sustained exhale came through the gap. I backed away by instinct, my heart hammering so hard it seemed to echo in my ribs. The exhale was not loud or threatening, but it had the unmistakable sound of someone trying to stay silent and failing. I stared at the panel, half expecting it to shift forward, but it did not move. Whoever was inside that hidden space was choosing not to show themselves, and that somehow made it worse. The silence that followed stretched so long it seemed about to break. I had the overwhelming feeling that if I looked away for too long, the panel would not look the same when I looked back. The gap behind it had footprints, food, and a lens. Now it had someone breathing, watching, waiting. Calling the host again seemed like the only reasonable option, although her earlier indifference had destroyed my trust. I stepped out onto the small porch to get away from the panel, gripping the phone so tightly I nearly dropped it. When she answered, her tone sounded tense, as if she had been waiting for the call but wishing it would not come. I explained what I had heard, every scrape, every movement, every breath. I could tell she wanted to dismiss it again, but something in my voice must have cut through her rehearsed responses. After a long pause, she admitted that the property had old access roads that previous owners had used for maintenance. When I mentioned the fresh footprints, she stopped speaking completely. Finally, she said she was on her way, but her hesitation made her sound less like someone coming to solve a problem and more like someone coming to contain it. The wait felt endless. I stayed outside under the hum of the porch light, looking through the window every few seconds to keep the panel in view. From outside, the room looked perfectly still, and that made me even more nervous. It felt prepared, as if someone inside the wall had also gone still now that I was out of reach. I imagined the hidden space running between the buildings, twisting and narrowing, with unknown corners concealed by decades of construction. Someone could crawl through all of that without setting foot inside the room. When headlights finally cut across the gravel driveway, I felt a wave of relief, brief but strong enough to make me step forward. The host got out of the car with a flashlight in her hand, avoiding eye contact as she walked toward me. She did not ask how I was. She did not apologize. She only told me to wait outside while she checked inside. I could not allow that. If there was someone in the wall, I was not going to let her go in alone. We entered together. Her flashlight moved across the floor, the corners, and finally stopped on the panel. Up close, even she seemed surprised by how out of place it looked. Without saying much, she pulled it and let it go. Behind it, the gap opened like a mouth into the darkness. Her light illuminated the footprints, the food container, and then deeper inside, the shiny object I had seen earlier. It was not a peephole. It was a small handheld camera pointed directly at the room. She stepped back quickly, breathing unevenly, and whispered that she had to call her husband. I did not wait to hear why. I grabbed my bag, shoved in all the equipment I could, and left while she remained frozen beside the wall. When I reached my car, she was on the phone, speaking in a low, frantic voice. I drove away without looking back, not wanting to see whether anything else moved inside that gap as I left. Later that night, she messaged me saying the problem had been handled and that the authorities had been notified. No explanation, no details, just a vague assurance that resolved nothing. I still do not know how long someone had been using that hidden corridor or how many guests were watched before me. All I know is that the panel was not there as decoration, and whoever was behind it had not been finished until we found the camera. Story 8. The Airbnb I booked that spring belonged to a family living in a quiet residential neighborhood on the outskirts of a small town. It was the kind of place where almost every house had wind chimes and faded porch swings. I had made the trip to get some distance from my cramped apartment and finish a remote project without constant interruptions. The listing showed a separate guest suite attached to the main house, with its own entrance and a small laundry room between the two spaces. I remember noticing that the laundry room door had an old brass handle, heavy with wear that looked almost like fingerprints frozen into the metal. The host, a woman named Laura, greeted me at check-in with a quick tour and a rehearsed explanation about privacy. Everything seemed simple, even comforting in that soft suburban way. The first few days passed quietly. I spent most of the time writing at the small desk by the window, listening to distant lawnmowers and the low hum of the refrigerator. It was not until the third morning that I noticed something in the laundry room that did not match how I had left it. A large bottle of detergent with a cracked blue cap had moved a few inches to the left on the shelf. It caught my attention because I remembered the uneven way it leaned after I had placed it back there after washing a pair of jeans. Now it stood perfectly straight, as if someone had corrected its posture. At the time, I blamed it on my memory playing tricks on me, though I kept replaying the image of how it had looked the night before. Later that same afternoon, I went to put a towel in the dryer and felt faint warmth still lingering inside the drum. There was damp clothing inside, thick flannel shirts and socks I did not recognize, soaked with a stronger detergent scent than the one I had brought. The strangest thing was the print on one of the shirts, a faded image of the mascot of a local high school I had never heard of. I stood there for a while, waiting for a clear explanation to appear in my mind, but none did. The laundry room door leading to my suite was locked from my side, and the listing insisted that the host would not need to enter the space during my stay. That night, something pulled me out of sleep. It was not a sudden noise, but a strange feeling that the air in the room had shifted, as if it had just moved. I lay still, listening. After a few seconds, faint footsteps came through the wall near the laundry room. They had a soft, shuffling rhythm, almost as if the person were trying to reduce the sound of each step. Then came whispers, two voices, one low and steady, the other barely audible, murmuring inside that narrow space behind the locked door. I sat up in bed, staring at the dark outline of the laundry room entrance, wondering how many nights it had happened without me noticing. Morning light made everything seem less alarming, though not by much. While reheating leftover coffee in the microwave, Laura came by under the pretext of checking the exterior gutter above the suite. She mentioned almost casually that a relative occasionally used the back room, tapping her knuckles against the laundry room door as if it were no big deal. The listing had been very clear about privacy. That was why her comment felt strange to me. I asked what she meant, and she only waved her hand, saying something about family routines and how the space worked for everyone. Her answer did not match the layout or the locks, and her casual tone only highlighted how rehearsed it sounded. I could not shake the feeling that she expected me to accept the explanation without thinking too much. The rest of the day, I kept looking toward the laundry room door. It had a worn baseboard, and the paint around the knob was chipped in a very pronounced crescent shape, as if someone wearing a ring had turned it repeatedly for years. At one point, while sitting at the desk, I heard a brief metallic click from inside, too sharp to be the house settling. I got up, pressed my ear against the door, and felt the faintest vibration in the wood, as if there was movement on the other side and someone had stopped when they sensed I was nearby. The idea slowly settled into my mind. Whoever was using that room was not doing laundry. They were passing through it. By early afternoon, my nerves were worn down by the constant awareness of that door. I tried going for a walk to clear my head. The neighborhood felt a little strange now. Too quiet. Too still. When I returned, I noticed something I had not seen before. Scuff marks on the tile near the laundry room door formed a narrow arc, suggesting that a heavy object had been turned or that a foot had rotated to keep balance. They were not mine. My shoes left a completely different pattern. That detail stayed with me more than I expected. It meant whoever was coming in was not trying to erase all evidence, only enough to avoid immediate suspicion. That night, before sleeping, I placed a suitcase and a folding metal chair against the laundry room door. Not as a real barricade, but as a way to wake myself if someone tried to enter. I left a lamp on, telling myself it was just for comfort, although I knew I did not fully believe that. Sometime after midnight, I heard the sound again. Movement barely perceptible, too constant to be pipes or settling wood. The chair trembled slightly, just enough to knock against the wall. Everything inside me stopped. I did not scream. I did not move. I just stared at the shadow under the door, watching it shift slowly, as if someone were studying the shape of my barricade from the other side. The moment that shadow moved away, I understood there was no possibility of going back to sleep. I sat on the bed for what felt like an hour, listening as the deep silence settled back into the walls. When I finally gathered the courage to approach the laundry room door, the air near it felt unusually cold, as if the room on the other side had been open to a draft. I moved the suitcase and gently pressed the edge of the door. The lock was still firm, exactly as I had left it. That should have reassured me, but it only confirmed that someone had found a way to move through that space without disturbing anything I controlled. I backed away slowly, making sure all the lights in the suite were on before returning to bed. At dawn, I packed in silence. The decision did not feel driven by panic. It was instinctive, necessary. Before leaving, I cautiously opened the laundry room door, half expecting someone to be behind it. Instead, I found a detail I had not noticed before. A narrow seam in the drywall behind the dryer, vertical, like a hidden panel. The edges were stained with faint gray marks, almost like fingers dragging across the plaster. I did not touch it. Seeing it was enough to understand how easy it would be for someone to come and go without using the locked door. Suddenly, the whole setup made sense in a way that made the room feel smaller. When I left, Laura was on the porch watering a pot of wilted basil. She did not seem surprised to see me leaving early. She only asked whether everything had been comfortable enough, phrasing it in a way that sounded more like a test than genuine concern. I told her I had a schedule change and needed to get on the road. She nodded slowly, as if she already knew I would not stay. Her expression showed no guilt or relief, only a strange, unreadable passivity that made me wonder how many other guests had cut their stay short without explanation. I did not wait for more conversation. I walked to my car, feeling the need to keep a steady pace until I reached the driver's seat. That same afternoon, I reported the listing, attaching everything I could describe without sounding unhinged. The platform received the report, but never followed up with details. They only confirmed that they were reviewing the matter. A week later, curiosity pushed me to search for the listing again. It had already been removed. No explanation, no replacement, nothing. I still think about that thin vertical line behind the dryer and the voices whispering in the dark. Whatever was happening in that house felt practiced, routine, as if I had simply stumbled into someone else's nighttime pattern. And although I left without confronting anyone, knowing that people had been walking through the suite while I slept stayed with me in a way that is difficult to shake.